One of the things that's coming up now in the latest research is the effect of stress on us. And if there's one scary thing that I'm really concerned about today in our companies and in our lives, is the effects of stress on our situation. Some studies have shown some really interesting things, and work by people like Robert Sapolsky down in Africa for the last 30 years. He was studying baboons and he was looking at the stress factors of baboons, and he noticed that the alpha males always had less stress than all those beneath them. When he followed those and they compared that with data from the British Civil Service, they discovered complete parallels. So if you're in the British Civil Service and you have a job that's higher up with more status, you actually have less stress than someone who's below you. Stress has been shown to shrink our brains. Not only does it shrink our brains, it actually adds fat to our abdomens and bellies across here. And what most people are not aware of is that that fat, which is created by mainly the stress hormone cortisol, itself puts out hormones, not only to keep building, but it creates deadly hormones that create even more stress. And the worst part is this: it unravels our chromosomes and causes us to live shorter lives. So what am I suggesting? In my course in mental mastery, there are some key steps that we talk about. The key steps are, first of all, you want to maximize your neural IQ with diet and lifestyle. Your neural IQ is sort of the potential you were born with. And it's really, unfortunately, when we don't eat well, when we don't have a good lifestyle, when we don't have enough sleep, you never really get to that full potential. The other thing is that you want to get in rhythm with your own mind and body. And one of the biggest things to remember is that the mind is not just in the brain. We tend to think of it as being in the brain because the brain is the organ that we generally use for thinking. But the mind is something different. The mind is actually throughout the whole body. And ultimately, your body and your brain talk together through small little pieces of protein called neuropeptides. And these little peptides talk to each other in such a way that you can actually use one to affect the other. So the next time that you're finding that you're depressed, and for seemingly no reason, and women do this all the time, men need a reason, women don't, it's because of your hormones probably. But what you do is that you start to smile. Now when you smile, you innately start creating endorphins. And what happens is that when you see yourself smile in the mirror, your body, seeing that, responds by saying, oh, I must be feeling better, and your mood will lift. Exercise your brain. So whether it's crossword puzzles, whatever, what we now know is that people, even with the gene from Alzheimer's, if you have taken learning and classes and kept active mentally, you have that much more, say 5 years more before the gene for Alzheimer's will hit. And finally is this one, and I call it develop a smart attitude. And that really means to question everything and to look at why the reasons are you do things the way that you do. Now, it turns out that not only do we have our own cognitive illusions, but our companies have mindsets too. So companies that value task and result, we'll call them left brain. And companies that value more people and process, we call them right brain. So if you're not doing good thinking, then what will happen is, these are some illusions done by James Lucas in his book, Fatal Illusions. He says, vision, having a mission statement means we know who we are. Cooperation, just give people a chance and they'll work together. And finally, openness, we can run this thing without sharing that information. So the biggest illusion we have is we think we're mentally balanced. Now what I've got here is an example of one of the instruments that I use in my mental mastery course, and it has some fantastic insights that I want to share with you today. And what the Herman Brain Dominance instrument is, it's an instrument that's done now It has a database of 2.6 million people. It's been around for over 30 years. And here's what's so fascinating. He took our model of right brain and left brain, and he's cut it in two more parts. So you could say this is actually an engineer by the name of John Doe. And his first mode would be, is he actually thinks in terms of the analytical, then he looks at the detail, then he looks at the big picture, and then he doesn't even think of how it might affect his wife at home. Not only is this interesting in that you actually can see under stress how he would think differently, what his mode of thinking would be. And not only that, companies have mindsets too. This is a picture of Trans-Canada Pipelines. So you can see how there'd be conflicts when you have mergers. Now I don't want to spend too much on it except to say this. This is an example of all, and it turns out that depending on how you're set, in a hospital you'll find most people will gravitate to different styles, where they're most at home, similar thinking styles. And my point to show you is that here are the key points that come out from this particular instrument. That the world as a whole, despite culture, is whole brain. What that means is that at any company, if there's 50 employees, you have available to you a whole brain. There's going to be enough to make so that somebody has a what you would call a preference for each of those groups in that particular company. Now, here are the other key points that we know. Homogeneous teams, that is to say, teams that all think alike, are subject to groupthink, and one of the things that you find if people that don't have different styles of thinking is they lack creativity. Heterogeneous teams, that is, teams with a large, diverse number of different thinking styles, are more creative and synergistic. And the best teams, it turns out, are comprised of mixed thinking style and are also gender balanced. Now, ultimately, you want to change the thinking and the organization will change itself. Wouldn't that be nice? And here's how Kirby and Hughes did in their, this is an old book called Thoughtware. But Thoughtware is not a program, it's already embedded in every organization, pushing, pulling, forming, and driving operations. The only question is it the right thoughtware? Another word for thoughtware, of course, would be mindset. And Einstein once remarked that if he were to be killed and had only 1 hour to figure out how to save his life, he would devote the first 55 minutes of that hour to searching for the right question. Once he had that question, finding the answer would take only 5 minutes. And one of the things that I promise my students, or I should say I warn my students when they come, is they often will get answers to some of their questions, but they will always end up with more questions. And that's really important. Now, whether we realize it or not, the mindset we have in our companies, it's been there a long time. And if there ever was a time when we maybe need to revamp it and maybe change it a little, it can only be done with us because we are the company ultimately. And I want us to look at the mindset that we look at our companies at. So what I'm going to talk about here is a book that was written many years ago by Arie de Geus, and it's still as pertinent now as it was then. And the question of Arie de Geus, who was at that time head of planning at Royal Dutch Shell, they were doing scenario planning and studies and things like that. And one of the things that he asked this question: what if we thought about a company as a living being? Now, why is that important, you ask? Well, think about if you see your company as a machine, then you find that the characteristics of a machine in the left brain mindset, they're owned by someone, their primary purpose is to make money. Identity is formed by outside factors. They break down, they need fixing, they're changed by outside forces, they learn as the sum of individuals learning, and they use human resources or intellectual capital. Do you hear those words? What is value? Task and result. What if you looked at your company instead of a machine as being a living being? Living beings exist in their own right, have their own unique purpose. They have a personal identity from within. They evolve naturally. They regenerate themselves. They learn as entities in themselves, and they are made up of working communities. Now, does that seem like a very different way of looking at things? Now, why is it important? It's important because you have a totally different purpose and meaning when you're in one mindset as opposed to the other. In effect, you need both. You need to have machines sometimes, but other times you need to see it as a living being. That's the important thing. And one of the aspects that came out of the work on scenario planning that Ari de Geus and his team worked at was that how companies manage to actually hang in there and stay alive a long time. Okay? Now here's what Peter Senge says in the foreword. How we view companies and systems reflect our core assumptions and values. I believe almost all of us adopt the machine assumption without ever thinking about it. In doing so, we probably mold the destiny of individual organizations far more than we can imagine. So what does that mean? Well, one of the things that they had discovered is that they looked at companies that would last a long time. And believe it or not, the way that they did it is they looked at companies that lasted more than 200 years to find out what is it exactly about some companies that make them last that long. And one of the companies was our own Hudson's Bay, right? A company of gentlemen adventurers. It turns out that when they looked at that as their criterion, they found 40 companies, and of those 40, they only managed to actually look in detail at 27. One of those companies went back to the 1100s, to the 12th century, a Swedish company called Stora that started out as a mining company and now is a chemical company, went through 8 transformations. So just think about that. And here's the thing, you don't have 100 to actually say statistically this is why probably they are, but here's the valuable insight. He discovered they were conservative in financial planning. That belongs up here. What that meant was that when there was money to be had, they had acquisitions. When there was tight times, there was money in the kitty to take them over the hump. They were sensitive to their environment. They were very much aware of what the kind of market they were in, and they kept really good organizational skills. They had a strong, cohesive sense of identity, so much so that people that go out to do something with the company feel they are the company representing, not just themselves, but everybody else. And finally, here's the big one. They're tolerant of unconventional thinking and experimentation. They had what are called skunk works, outfits that were on the fringe, but actually would be a real source of creativity. Now take a look at all these 4, and I'm going to suggest to you, could it be the reason these companies have lasted is they actually have a whole brain? What you've got is a balance between left and right. So I'm going to end up by saying this little statement. We must be willing to get rid of the life we plan so as to have the life that is waiting for us. We often have illusions of what we think we know. And the truth is, our beliefs are not really tested until they're totally challenged. You'll go through life, and it's only when that challenge comes up that you'll start to examine your beliefs and your core values. And it's then when you have the opportunity to grow.